Black panel was a good place to live. But you have Yes, thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. We are very happy to, it's okay, go ahead, Nancy. We are very happy to welcome you here today. This is the fourth day, the final event of our Morristown celebrations for that favorite Frenchman. On Friday night, we had a lovely welcome reception at the Women's Club of Morristown. There's quite a few members here, which is at 51 South Street, but more important, the house of Dr. Louis Condit, who was the gentleman that welcomed Lafayette during the festivities on the Morristown Green. And the next day, the next 2 days at that same house, we had a pop-up museum where we had wonderful treasures and artifacts from Lafayette. We actually had really nice treasures that were actually owned by Lafayette. And it's a wonderful house. Many people were saying, oh, I used to walk by this house. It's very mysterious. Yeah. And now they've had their tours, which is wonderful. It's a lovely place. And then yesterday, of course, was our parade. How many of you saw the parade? Oh, that's wonderful. It was a great parade. Carol was the one, Carol Barker, my co-chair, who helped arrange the parade and all the different events on the green. You know, people often tell me, like Amanda over here, who's the director of the Heritage Commission, you have how many people at your exhibit?
315 to the table.
So this was also wonderful for all the different groups, you know, that participate in the greater historic community. So now today is a little bit different. We get to hear more about the man, Lafayette. Who was he? And why did he become a human rights champion? And why did he come to the New World, if you will, incurring the wrath of Louis XVI? I think he snuck out of Spain on a ship. So we have some wonderful experts here today for you to ask questions to and hear about our favorite Frenchman. At least he's my favorite Frenchman. So you all have the programs. It's very, very easy. In the morning, we're having our 2 keynote speakers. And then in the afternoon, after lunch, we have some nice box lunches for you, for our speaker, if you know her from Morristown. After lunch, we'll have a panel, and you'll get to pose your questions to the 2 experts, and frankly, all the other 3 are experts too in their own field. So we're very glad you're here. We have an overflow room that's completely filled. We have another room in the back that's waiting for people. And by the way, we are filming this via Zoom, and through the courtesy of Kevin Hoffman, the editor of the Morristown Week. He's going to allow the video to run for 5 full days on his website after it's audited. So the community really has come together for Lafayette. So that's what it looks like. And now I'm very pleased to introduce our first keynote speaker, a gentleman that I've been pleased to know for the past 2 years. You see his bio in there in your program, but I'd like to mention what I think is amazing. This gentleman is a retired attorney, went to law school, and he is the one who translated from French into English Auguste Lafayette's account of Lafayette here. Auguste was Lafayette's traveling secretary. And over the past 20 years or so, Alan has really helped build the organization, the American Friends of Lafayette. He goes to many of these wonderful reenactment events. He goes to the trail marker events, and he's always available to pitch in whenever there is a need for people to learn about this amazing man. You can find him on the websites. He has his own, and he's truly incredible. So I appreciate him being here. His wife Marilyn is here. And I did want to say that they had their wedding celebration. How many years ago, Ellen?
More than 50.
More than 50 years ago. In Morristown at the old Governor Morris. Isn't that a nice home? Yeah. So please join me in giving a very good Morristown welcome to the president of the American Friends of Lafayette, Alan Hoffman.
Thank you, Wendy, for the kind introduction, and you're going to thank her as well because she gave me a strict time. As she noted, my wife Marilyn made an honest man of me more than 50 years ago at the Governor Morris. So it's a sentimental place for us as well. So Wendy did ask me to address, before I get into the principal subject of my being here, she asked me to address the significance of Lafayette's arrival on May 10th, 1780, and the wonderful statuary that now commemorates that. So I'll start off. She gave me about 7 minutes for that, and then the rest of my presentation will be about 20. So I think we'll be within the 30-minute limit. So I titled this, History is Made, Lafayette's Arrival at Morristown, May 10, 1780. Lafayette, 19 years old, came to America in 1777 and joined the Continental Army as a major general. He served in the Battle of the Brandywine, part of the British Army's successful campaign to take Philadelphia, where he was wounded, at Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey, and the Rhode Island campaign in August of 1778, before returning to France on furlough. He departed our shores from Boston on the USS Alliance on January 11, 1779. In France, he rejoined the French army. Because his reputation in America had preceded him, and he was considered the expert on the war in America, Lafayette had complete access to the principal ministers, Vergennes and Morquet, the foreign and prime ministers, and he used this access to bombard the ministers with ideas to advance the American cause. Morristown groused that Lafayette would sell all the furniture at Versailles and use the money to help the American cause. Specifically, in writing and orally, Lafayette lobbied for a French expeditionary force to be based in America. That was his concept. Well, the Americans weren't too sure about it. They had some skepticism about the French. The leading 19th century American biographer of Lafayette, Charlemagne Tower Jr., wrote this about what he called the July 18, 1779 memorial that Lafayette sent to Vergennes, in which he fleshed out his ideas for a French expeditionary force to be based in America. Quote, "This document is one of great importance in the history of our country, and it had a far-reaching influence upon the destinies of the United States. It was the culminating point of Lafayette's intercession, as it was the embodiment of his sentiments of friendship and of gratitude towards us, as shown by his unalterable purpose to help us. It represents beyond doubt his greatest service to America. It was the starting point of a series of events which led up to the surrender of the British Army under Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. The memorial was carefully studied by Monsieur de Vergennes, upon whom it made a favorable impression immediately, and it was submitted by him to the Premier, Monsieur de Maurepas, who also approved of the general tenor of the proposition. An early 20th century historian, James Perkins, author of France and the American Revolution, gave this title to the chapter in his book about Lafayette's role in 1779 and 1780 in lobbying the ministers. Quote, Lafayette to the rescue. Thus it was that in March 1780, Lafayette was dispatched back to America to report to Washington that the French were coming. From aboard the Hermione at the entrance to Boston Harbor, actually Marblehead, he actually spent the night with General Glover. He got off the ship and spent the night in Marblehead. He wrote Washington on Thursday, April 27, 1780, quote, I have affairs of the utmost importance that I should communicate to you alone. He disembarked from the Hermione at Boston on April 28th. Here is a newspaper account of Lafayette's arrival and stay in Boston. I find it remarkable because when I think of Lafayette, I think about the popularity that he had as a result of the Virginia campaign and the siege of Yorktown. But as you'll see from this account, he was already extremely popular in the United States. Last Friday arrived in this port the frigate L'Hermione. They spelled it L'Hermione. His Excellency, the Right Honorable the Marquis de Lafayette, Major General in the service of His Christian Majesty and in the line of the United States. His arrival being made known by one of his aides, the joy of the people at his revisiting the state was fully demonstrated by his reception. He was congratulated on his safe arrival by the supreme executive and legislative bodies of the state then sitting, and was requested to denote the time and place of his landing that he might be received agreeable to the exalted character of a nobleman who had suffered and bled in the cause of virtue and mankind, and particularly for the independence of the United States. He politely returned his civilities and begged to be landed in a private manner. Notwithstanding, a large number of respectable gentlemen of the town, with a number of officers of the army, attended with a band of music, assembled on the Grand Pier, impatiently expecting him. Now, the Grand Pier is Long Wharf, Boston. But to their disappointment, he landed at General Hancock's Wharf, now known as Lewis Wharf, probably about less than a quarter of a mile away. The gentlemen of the sword, determined to pay their devoirs to their commander and friend, repaired thither with the band and escorted him to genteel lodgings prepared for him in State Street, amidst the salutation of cannon, the ringing of bells, the flying of colors, and the acclamations of the populace, where he was personally and publicly received by a committee of both houses. The features of gratefulness were conspicuous on every countenance, and a vast and respectable concourse of people seemed to acknowledge their obligations to this great and disinterested commander. Soon after, he had a conference with the General Assembly, when the present state of Europe respecting America was inquired into, and the Marquis's accounts received with applause. In the evening, a bonfire was made before his home, attended by a large display of fireworks from the balcony of the Exchange Tavern, where a respectable number of young gentlemen of the town convened to denote their joy at his arrival and their respect for his character. So you see, he was already greatly popular by 1780. Lafayette left Boston. He was probably so thrilled by the reception that he stayed a few days longer than he really should have. He left Boston on May 2, 1780, and traveled by land to Morristown, where Washington and his army were encamped. He arrived on May 10. On that day, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton wrote Baron Steuben, "We have heard from the Marquis. He will be here at dinner. Will you dine with us?" The general requested. Upon his arrival, Lafayette told Washington that a naval squadron would soon bring a French expeditionary force to America to support the cause of the United States. The news electrified patriotic Americans throughout the country. Now, as a result of the news, in June of 1780, when Virginia devolved Kentucky, one of the three counties was named Lafayette County, which is now Lexington, Kentucky. The other two were Jefferson County and Lincoln County, after Benjamin Lincoln, the American general. Rochambeau arrived with his 5,500-man army and squadron of ships in July of 1780 at Newport, Rhode Island. In early 1781, Lafayette was sent to Virginia and engaged the British General Cornwallis in the spring and summer, ultimately entrapping the 7,000-man British army at Yorktown. These operations became known as Lafayette's Virginia Campaign. In the summer of 1780, what is now a national historic trail, the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route, saw Rochambeau's and Washington's army join Lafayette's troops in Virginia and the French West Indian fleet under the Comte de Grasse, which had blockaded the York River for the successful siege of Yorktown. Now, Admiral de Grasse landed 3,000 French troops. So if you include the Navy personnel on these 30-some-odd ships, plus Rochambeau's army and the 3,000 French troops, there were definitely more French at the siege of Yorktown than American soldiers. The Franco-American victory at Yorktown ended major combat and led directly to the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which confirmed the independence of the United States of America. So you see, Lafayette's arrival in Morristown, which is memorialized in the wonderful group sculpture of Washington, Hamilton, and Lafayette, three of the most important founding fathers of the United States, shows a principal turning point in the American Revolution. The event that is captured in that sculpture, Lafayette's imparting the news of the arrival of the French Expeditionary Force, is a critical moment in the story of Lafayette's independence, and Morristown should be very proud of it. Thank you. Now I will turn to one of the principal elements of Lafayette's legacy. When I first came to Lafayette, it was through the farewell tour. I read a book in which it was described, and I said to myself, what was all the fuss about? That's how I came to translate that book. But I also started reading everything I could about Lafayette, and very soon I was tremendously impressed by the breadth and depth of his human rights career. And one of the principal elements of that is his anti-slavery advocacy. So this piece is entitled Lafayette and the Anti-Slavery Cause to Ameliorate the Condition of the Distressed. During Lafayette's farewell tour in 1824 and 1825, Americans not only acknowledged his important role in the American Revolution, but also lauded him for his universal approach to the betterment of the human race. In Pembroke, New Hampshire, on June 22, 1825, Stephen Webster, Daniel Webster's brother, said, "We admire the persevering activity with which you have sought all possible occasions to ameliorate the condition of the distressed." In Concord, New Hampshire, at a banquet for 700, including 200 Revolutionary War veterans, on the State House lawn later that day, one toaster described Lafayette as the universal philanthropist. Lafayette's human rights portfolio included such causes as national revolutions to create independent nation states, religious freedom, anti-slavery advocacy, rights of women, support of Native Americans, prison reform, and even abolition of the death penalty. At the core of his human rights advocacy was Lafayette's 50-year opposition to slavery. Yet, when the 19-year-old freedom fighter arrived in South Carolina in 1777 to join the American Army. He was at best a blank slate and at worst naive and obtuse with respect to chattel slavery. In a letter to his wife from Charleston, I think it was called Charlestown then, dated June 19, 1777, he wrote, quote, "In America, there are no paupers or even the sort of people we call peasants. Every individual has an adequate amount of property, a considerable number of Negroes, and the same rights as the most powerful proprietor in the land." 7 years later, on October 17, 1784, James Madison, who had spent a month traveling with Lafayette during the first of his 2 victory laps across America, wrote to Thomas Jefferson that one of Lafayette's 3 hobby horses in politics was the manumission of slaves. The others were the alliance between France and America and the Union of the United States. In the sense used by Madison, hobby horse, which is a child's toy, means preoccupation or even obsession. Lafayette's evolution on the issue of slavery is traceable principally, in my view, to his experience with African Americans in the American Army. First, he commanded troops that had African Americans among them. In this regard, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment stands out. First slide, please. That's a contemporary painting, and that's the uniform, the white uniforms that they wore. This regiment consisted of enslaved blacks and Native Americans whom Rhode Island recruited by promising them their freedom if they served for the entire war, as many of them did. They saw combat in August 1778 during the Rhode Island campaign, an unsuccessful effort by the Americans to take Newport back from the British. They came under Lafayette's command in September of 1778, when he was assigned to defend the mainland from a possible British attack. The survivors were a part of the combined Rhode Island Regiment, the 1st and 2nd Regiments, in September of October 1781, when they served under Lafayette's overall command in the siege of Yorktown. When Lafayette was visiting New Orleans in April 1825, he requested a meeting. He often requested meetings with Native Americans and African Americans, but he requested a meeting with African American veterans of the War of 1812. According to the Courier newspaper of New Orleans of April 19, 1825, quote, "The general received the men of color with demonstrations of esteem and affection, and said to them, quote, Gentlemen, I have often during the War of Independence seen African blood shed with honor in our ranks for the cause of the United States. I have learned with the liveliest interest how you answered to the appeal of General Jackson, what a glorious use you made of your arms for the defense of Louisiana. I cherish the sentiments of gratitude for your services and of admiration for your valor. Accept those also of my personal friendship and of the pleasure I shall always experience in meeting with you again." The general then kindly shook hands with them all and thanked the governor for the opportunity he had given him to become acquainted with me. Second, there is Lafayette's relationship with James, an enslaved man whom his owner, William Armistead, volunteered for service under Lafayette during the Virginia campaign of 1781. James proved to be a reliable double agent in General Charles Cornwallis's camp. Among other intelligence that he provided to Lafayette was the news that the British would be fortifying Yorktown. In 1784, while Lafayette was in Virginia in his first post-Revolutionary War tour of the United States, he wrote a testimonial in support of James' petition for freedom, outlining, next slide please, outlining the important services that James had provided to him. Now that image of James, that's a broadside that was produced during the farewell tour. It's based on a painting by James Blennerhassett Martin. It's a wonderful painting of James. So we actually have a wonderful image of this man, this important spy for the United States. In 1787, the Virginia legislature granted James his freedom. James was so grateful to the general that he took his surname and called himself James Lafayette, or as some historians now believe, James Fayette. During the farewell tour at Yorktown on October 18, 1825, Lafayette spied James in the crowd that had assembled to greet him on his return after 43 years. According to the Richmond Enquirer, a black man even, who had rendered him services by way of information as a spy, for which he was liberated by the state, was recognized by him in the crowd and called to him by name and taken into his embrace. Such public displays of interracial affection were rare in both the antebellum South and the North. As William Cooper Nell, an African-American historian and abolitionist, wrote in his history called Colored Patriots of the American Revolution in 1855, Lafayette was not tainted by American color phobia. As early as February 1783, Lafayette's views on slavery were substantially evolving. In a letter to his mentor, George Washington, he proposed a plan which might become, quote, greatly beneficial to the black part of mankind. He wrote, "Let us unite in purchasing a small estate where we may try the experiment to free the Negroes and use them only as tenants. Such an example as yours might render it a general practice, and if we succeed in America, I will cheerfully devote a part of my time to render the method fashionable in the West Indies. If it be a wild scheme, I had rather be manned that way than be thought wise on the other tack." Although Washington replied that the proposal, quote, is a striking evidence of the benevolence of your heart, and expressed a willingness to join his protege in so laudable a work, he never did. Instead, in 1785 and 1786, Lafayette purchased plantations in Cayenne in the French colony of Guyana on the northern coast of South America. The next slide, please. That's a map, and the arrow shows approximately where Lafayette's plantations were. There, he hired an overseer and gave him strict instructions as to the lenient treatment of the black workers and the implementation of a policy of education and gradual emancipation of the workers. Sadly, the experiment came to an abrupt end when Lafayette's properties were confiscated in late 1792 after the radicals took control of the French Revolution. Lafayette had fled from France to the Austrian Netherlands in August 1792. He was subsequently imprisoned for 5 years by Prussian and Austrian monarchs. The importance to Lafayette of this emancipation project is illustrated by a letter which he sent to his wife's relative who was in exile in Holland from prison in Wandsburg, Prussia in March of 1793. Lacking information about the status of his wife and family in France, he wrote in a postscript, "I do not know what has happened to my plantation in Cayenne, but I hope that my wife will see to it that the blacks who farm it preserve their freedom." During the late 1780s, before the French Revolution and his subsequent imprisonment, Lafayette joined abolition societies in 3 countries: France, where he joined the Société des Amis des Noirs, Society of the Friends of the Blacks; England; and the United States, where he joined the New York Manumission Society, created by Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. One biographer of Lafayette, Jason Lane, noted that in 1788, Lafayette would become the first person to be involved in the abolition movement at an international level. With respect to his American friends who relied on the labor of enslaved workers, Lafayette spoke truth to power. In the wake of the controversy over allowing slavery in the newly formed states that had led to the Missouri Compromise in 1820, ex-President Jefferson wrote Lafayette to explain his theory of diffusion. Jefferson believed that slavery should be allowed in the new territories. He argued that the expansion of slavery would alleviate overcrowding in the tidewater regions, and conditions for enslaved workers there and in the new territories would be ameliorated. Lafayette's response in a letter dated July 1, 1821, to one of his closest American friends seems somewhat scathing. Are you sure, my dear friend, that extending the principle of slavery to the new raised states is a method to facilitate the means of getting rid of it? I would have thought that by spreading the prejudices, habits, and calculations of planters over a larger surface, you rather increase the difficulties of final liberation. Was it not for that deplorable circumstance of Negro slavery in the southern states, not a word could be objected when we present American doctrines and constitutions to old Europe. Nearly 50 years after Lafayette's farewell tour visits to Monticello in 1824 and 1825, Israel Gillette Jefferson, a former enslaved worker there, wrote about a carriage ride with the general and ex-president Jefferson. Quote, Lafayette remarked that he thought that the slaves ought to be free, that no man could rightfully hold ownership in his brother man, that he gave his best services to and spent money on behalf of the Americans freely, because he felt that they were fighting for a great and noble cause, a noble principle, the freedom of mankind. That instead of being free of portion were held in bondage, which seemed to grieve his noble heart. That it would be mutually beneficial to masters and slaves if the latter were educated. This conversation was very gratifying to me, and I treasured it up in my heart. At Montpelier in November 1824, Lafayette engaged James Madison and his neighbors in a debate over the issue of slavery. Lafayette lobbied Chief Justice John Marshall, who spent a whole week with him in Richmond in 1824, by sending him an anti-slavery pamphlet, Benjamin Lundy's A Plan for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery in the United States in 1825. Although his anti-slavery views were well known in America, Lafayette did not generally publicly advocate for them on his 13-month farewell tour. He likely pulled his punches in deference to many of his hosts, yet he repeatedly took actions, privately and in public, which signaled that African Americans should be treated as equals with a recognition of their dignity as human beings. He greeted or was greeted by African Americans in many places, including, according to the public record, New York City, Troy, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Yorktown, and Richmond, Virginia, Columbia, South Carolina, Savannah, and Concord, New Hampshire. In Manhattan, in September of 1824, Lafayette made a point to visit the African Free School, the creation of the New York Manumission Society, of which he was a member. There, the star pupil, James McCune Smith, an 11-year-old enslaved boy, gave the welcoming address. The next slide, by the way, is a 1824 engraving of the African Free School. There were 400 to 500 students present on that day to see Lafayette. General Lafayette, on behalf of myself and my fellow schoolmates, may I be permitted to express our sincere and respectful gratitude to you for the condescension you have manifested this day in visiting this institution, which is one of the noblest specimens of New York philanthropy. Here, sir, you behold hundreds of the poor children of Africa sharing with those of a lighter hue in the blessings of education. And while it would be our pleasure to remember the great deeds that you have done for America, it will be our delight to cherish the memory of General Lafayette as a friend to African emancipation and as a member of this institution. McCune Smith was the first African American to earn a medical degree at the University of Glasgow, Scotland, because of American colophobia. He opened the first Black-owned pharmacy in New York City, in Manhattan. He also wrote important scientific papers and was an abolitionist and a close friend and colleague of Frederick Douglass. During the farewell tour, a number of southern cities and towns had passed ordinances or made proclamations prohibiting Blacks from attending the public events in honor of Lafayette, like the parades and the militia reviews. Among them may have been Columbia, South Carolina. They were concerned about his possible influence on these African Americans. In any event, on that day, on March 11, 1825, after the parade and militia review, there was a reception for Columbia's elite at a private residence. Pompey Fortune, a free black who was an enslaved man, had worked on waited on Lafayette in South Carolina in 1777, barged into the reception asking for Lafayette. According to an account by a militiaman who was present, Lafayette recognized Pompey, shook his hand warmly, and, quote, called for a glass of champagne, which that worthy took with great dignity. Afterwards, Pompey said goodbye and they shook hands again. By the way, those Southern officials, municipal officials, were right to be concerned. Lewis Hayden was an enslaved boy in Lexington, Kentucky, when Lafayette arrived in May of 1825. He told this story in a memoir he wrote late in life. Hayden was standing on a fence on Lafayette's route. When the general passed, he bowed towards the fence that the boy was on. Hayden looked around and saw he was alone on the fence. He was so frightened that he ran to a different, more crowded location. He concluded, Lafayette was the most famous man I had ever heard of, and you can imagine how I felt. A slave boy to be favored with his recognition. That act burnt his image upon my heart, so I shall never need a permit to recall it. I date my hatred of slavery from that day, and I tell you that after I allowed no moving thing on the face of the earth to stand between me and my freedom. Hayden escaped to Boston years later, became a leading abolitionist, and later a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. The next slide is a photograph of Lewis Hayden. The house where Hayden and his wife Harriet lived is one of the featured places on the African American Freedom Trail in Boston. Lafayette even had a posthumous influence on the abolitionist movement. A statement attributed to him by his good friend, British abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, was published in 1846. At this time, Lafayette, as a result of the farewell tour, was the most popular man in America. Clarkson said in a letter published in William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator on January 2, 1846, that Lafayette was decidedly as uncompromising as any on the subject of slavery. He has said frequently, I would never have drawn my sword in the cause of America if I could have conceived that thereby I was founding a land of slavery. Lafayette's popularity at that time, in 1846, is exemplified by the publication of a full-color broadside in New York called The Pictorial History of the United States. With the seals of the states and territories on the perimeter and printed information about population statistics, famous battles, and a list of eminent men, three figures dominate the field. Washington in the middle, to his left, Franklin on his good right hand, Lafayette. Not Adams, Hamilton, Madison, or even Jackson, but Lafayette. Between 1846, I think the next slide might be a close-up. That's a close-up of the three figures. Between 1846 and 1865, abolitionists like Charles Sumner and Wendell Phillips quoted what I call Lafayette's anti-slavery lament in speeches and publications. A broadside quoting Lafayette's lament, amplified by exclamation points, was published in Boston in the 1850s. Next slide, please. That's the broadside. It's in the William Lloyd Garrison collection of the Boston Public Library. I thank Diane Shaw for this factoid. This broadside was observed on the wall at a memorial service for John Brown at the very end of 1859, at the time, very shortly after he was hanged. Wendell Phillips, the celebrated orator of the abolitionist movement, when asked for his autograph, often wrote a statement of a famous person, attributed the statement to that person, the source, then signed his own name below. He most often quoted John Brown. For example, Phillips is known to have written this above his own autograph. Quote, John Brown taught these lines to each of his children. Peace if possible, justice at any time. In May of 1864, Phillips paraphrased Lafayette's anti-slavery lament. Quote, I would never have drawn my sword in the cause of America if I had thought that thereby I was helping to found a nation of slaves. Next slide. And then Phillips wrote Lafayette and signed his own name. The last slide is a close-up of the autograph. So you see that the abolitionist movement used Lafayette, perhaps the most popular man in America at the time, to advance their cause decades after the general's death in 1834. Thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for 2 questions, but I assure you, after lunch, Alan will return on the panel, and you'll have the opportunity to pose many more. So who would like to start? Raise your hand.
Yes, ma'am.
John Lawrence, who was one of Washington's aides, a South Carolinian, son of, I believe, president of the Continental Congress, was one who was coming up with ideas for creating a Black regiment based upon freeing slaves. Do you think that he was influenced in that by Lafayette?
Well, the question is whether I think that Lafayette was influenced by John Lawrence.
The other way around.
That John Lawrence was influenced by Lafayette?
Yes.
Boy, I would, Lafayette kind of came a little later to his anti-slavery principles, I think. And I think John Lawrence was before him. He was already trying to raise a regiment in South Carolina. So, you know, if there was any influence, it might have gone the other way. Although I've never seen any, people say that it was John, you know, they see the play Hamilton, the musical, but I've never seen anything to establish that. I've never seen any source that says that, but they spent a fair amount of time together. It's certainly somewhere between possible and probable that there was an influence. Yes.
So we had the first Rhode Island in our parade and on the green. Oh, we had the first Rhode Island in our parade yesterday and on the green. And I think I read that they were in every single battle of the Revolution. I don't know about that, but maybe you could shed a little more light on their contributions.
Yeah, well, they were certainly in the Rhode Island campaign and in the defense of Rhode Island in September of 1778. And we know that they were still around in 1781. They were in the army that entire period because one of the conditions of the statute that the Rhode Island legislature passed is that they had to win their freedom, they had to serve for the duration of the American Revolution. There was one other account that it actually appears in Cooperdale's book, The Black Patriots of the American Revolution. There was a British raid, and I should know this, but I don't, but it was in Westchester when the army was in Westchester, and the British surprised the Americans, which included the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. And their commander was named Christopher Green, who was a cousin of Nathaniel Greene. And 4 of them, at least, lost their lives to defend their commander in that skirmish. I guess you could call it a skirmish or a raid. So they weren't in every battle. They were mostly based in the North. So they didn't get, for example, voted with General Greene to North Carolina, South Carolina, etc. And there was kind of a lull in the war for a period of time. But they were there till the end, and we know that they were in Rhode Island, and we know that they defended their commander in this one raid. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And we'll have plenty of time after lunch to post some more questions. I'm delighted now to introduce our second keynote speaker. You've seen her bio in the program, and I have a few comments. She had a career as an archivist, which is amazing. And from my perspective, she developed that career into, being an amazing expert on Lafayette. Now, she could answer just about any question on Lafayette, but she has developed specialties in abolition, and more recently, I understand it, within Native Americans. So she drove in here last night to be with us today, and I'm really grateful for that. She did work all that time at Lafayette College, so, I think Lafayette is probably shining down on us and very happy. So please join me in bringing to the podium the Curator Emerita of the Lafayette Collections at Lafayette College, Diane Shaw.